Welcome to the Short Stacks, our shorter conversations with authors about their process and their books. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today we are joined by author and journalist Radley Balko, who writes for The Washington Post. His first book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop, is a look at the militarization of police in America. And his second book, which he co-wrote with Tucker Carrington, is an in-depth look at the criminal justice system through forensic and death investigation. That book, The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, is the subject of our chat today and will be the Stacks Book Club pick for August 28th. Don't worry, no spoilers today. Everything we talk about on today's episode can be found in the link in the show notes. That link will take you to the books, movies, articles, and everything else that gets discussed. Also in the show notes are links to our social media accounts so you can stay connected to the Stacks. For sure, take a moment and follow us over on Instagram at The Stacks Pod and check out our website, thestackspodcast.com. If you want more of The Stacks, head over to patreon.com/The Stacks to be part of our bookish community. Patreon allows listeners to help support this show while earning cool perks, including our virtual book club, where we video chat to dissect the most recent Stacks Book Club picks. If you're interested in being part of the Stacks Pack, head over to patreon.com/The Stacks to check it out. If you like what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you're listening through Apple Podcasts. All right, now it's time for my spoiler-free conversation with Radley Balko, co-author of The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist. All right, Radley Balko is here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
We're really excited. We're going to be talking about your book in great detail in August on the podcast. For those of you who aren't familiar, the book is called The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist, a true story of injustice in the American South. You wrote it with Tucker Carrington. I always want to call him the other Tucker's name.
I actually made that mistake in a speech once and profusely apologized.
I mean, it's like so close. I was tweeting about the book and I was like, oh my God, I almost tagged the wrong person.
Yeah, Tucker occasionally wears a bow tie, I think.
Yeah, well, your Tucker is like a very serious lawyer, so I feel like that's a good distinction. All right, Radley, can you tell me in about 30 seconds or so about The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist?
Sure. So the book is uses Mississippi as a lens to kind of examine the death investigation system in America. And we look at the coroner system, how it's evolved over the years, how it's been kind of manipulated by people in power. And then we look at Mississippi in particular, where one medical examiner for about 20 years was doing 80 to 85% of the autopsies, along with his, that would be the Cadaver King, along with his sidekick, who would be the country dentist, who was this kind of forensics charlatan who claimed to be able to divine all sorts of miraculous things from marks that he would find on bodies that he claimed nobody else could see. So the book is it's a look at Mississippi and that system and the corruption that was involved there. But it's also kind of a broader look at forensics and junk science in the courtroom and how the system has done a really inadequate job at keeping bad science out of courtrooms and away from juries.
Yeah, and it's really amazingly well researched. You're a journalist, and your co-author Tucker Carrington is a lawyer. I know that Tucker worked on some of the cases, but I'm curious kind of how the book came to each of you or came to you and how you guys came to one another to write a book together, because you do come from such different backgrounds. Right.
So my first kind of expose on Dr. Hain, the Cadaver King, was in 2006, I believe. And it was in Reason magazine. And it came with I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that kind of went with the article. And as coincidentally, Tucker had just started his job as director of the Mississippi Innocence Project when that came out. And I had called him just to kind of make him aware of my article and to just kind of, pick his brain about what he had found. And he had just started reading about Hain cases before the Mississippi Supreme Court. It was Tucker's a very straightforward guy. And so can I swear on your podcast?
Oh, yeah, you sure can.
Okay. So I called him, and really without even feeling me out, talked to him about 30 seconds, and he said, man, this state is fucked up. He's like, you're just not you wouldn't believe what I found down here already. And, Tucker has grown to actually love the state of Mississippi itself. But I think he'd probably agree that the legal system is still in that particular state. But, and then over the years, he started taking on these cases, and then I continued to write about them, and we would touch base, and, he would give me leads on a new case he had found. And we'd just chat about them over the years. And at some point, I think we both realized that one of the frustrating things about writing about a particular case was that you couldn't really provide the kind of historical context that was necessary to really for readers to really realize what a massive scandal this really was. And we really thought that only a book could do that justice. And we were really the two people who were in the best position to write that book. I will tell you, our original manuscript of the book was about twice as long as the original book. So I'm not even sure even a book was long enough to give the full context, but it definitely does a better job than an article could.
And how did you guys divide the work? Like, did you write different chapters, or was one of you responsible for the writing and the other one the research, or how did it kind of come together?
Right. Well, we'd both done a lot of writing already. He had written a couple of law review articles. He, of course, had written countless briefs and court filings. I had written, I don't know how many articles about this over the years, easily hundreds of thousands of words. So a lot of it, particularly sort of when you get into the late 90s on chronologically, a lot of that work was done. We just had to kind of synthesize it into the book. But before that, the book, there is a lot of history in the book as well. I think we kind of shared the research. I think, Tucker is obviously the legal mind. So he was good at kind of processing the case law. In the end, I kind of did, I'm not going to say I did all of the writing, but I kind of went over all of the writing just so the book would be in one voice. But, I thought I would have a very difficult time working with another author because, I don't know. I work better on my own, but, Tucker was a very easy person to work with. And, I think we worked well together.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that stuck out with me, I've read not a ton of books that have co-authors, but there's very few that have kind of two authors' notes, which I really liked.
Yeah, it was a bit of we had to kind of figure out how to do that in a way that made sense so that we weren't kind of switching voice and tone. And, but yeah, we both came to this from very different places. Although I think, we obviously have a similar perspective on what happened. But, we wanted to let people know that we both kind of arrived at the same place, even though we started, I came at it from a journalistic perspective and he came at it from a legal perspective.
Right. And then you mentioned like you had started working on this in 2006 and it was kind of articles and obviously not a book. At what point in your work on this story or these stories did you decide this is a book? Like I do need all the context. I
mean, I wanted to write a book about this 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And I had actually put together a book proposal and shopped it around, and it was rejected by pretty much every publishing company in New York. And
Rude.
Then, yeah. And then in 2013, I wrote a very different book about police militarization. And it did very, very well, well enough that, I got the opportunity to kind of write another one and write this one and pitch this one again. And so, yeah, it ended up being the same publisher that published my first book. And, we're happy with them. I think they did a great job. The book was heavily lawyered, which I think maybe dilutes the prose a little bit. I tend to write in a bit of a stronger voice and a bit less kind of, I don't know what the word is. We had to soften the language a little bit. But,
What's that process like? Like, does someone read the book and go through with like a Sharpie and say, gotta change that word, like gotta write allegedly, or how does that work?
Basically my first book, which was also, about a fairly controversial topic, but the legal vetting process was a 10-minute phone call. For this book, we did probably 3 or 4 weeks of phone calls that usually lasted, over an hour each. And then we had to basically completely rewrite the book. And then after that, it was about another 6 months of phone calls.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the attorney went over every line. Publisher has to protect themselves. I
Right.
understand why they did that. Personally, I don't think Hain was ever going to sue us. I think he sued the Innocence Project, which we talk about in the book, and the discovery from that lawsuit ended up, providing a lot of the fodder for our book.
Right.
So I think getting into another discovery process, and we actually had a lot of stuff that we didn't put in the book that I'm pretty sure he would not want to be published. Things that came out from his, divorce and a few other things. I don't think he was ever going to sue, but I wasn't the one putting up all the money to publish the book, so
Right.
we had to kind of do what they wanted.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, also because you wrote it with a lawyer, like I wonder, I just feel like that's like another lawyerly voice in your ear being like, "Can we do this?"
Yeah, Tucker and I were generally on the same page with the the stuff that they thought might be defamatory. And the lawyer that worked for the publisher, she was just doing her job as well. I think it was just I think this probably happens with any kind of serious investigative journalism book. There's always going to be a little bit of push and pull with legal people about what eventually makes it into the book.
Right.
But we have supporting documentation for every allegation we make in the book. This book is nothing if not well documented. I don't know how many pages of endnotes we have, but we've got a cloud version of our endnotes, and then we've got them all printed out, and there are 30, 40 binders of notes. So
wow, that's incredible. About you as a writer and a journalist, you mentioned your first book, and it's about the police system, and I kind of am curious how you got on that beat, like how you came to kind of criminal justice, police, all that, where that came from.
In the early 2000s, I worked for the Cato Institute in Washington, which is a libertarian think tank. When I was there, I convinced them that they needed a civil liberties person to doing civil liberties policy, and that I had done a lot of freelance writing. I was editing their website at the time, and convinced them. I think with my own writing, I had a blog at the time that I should be doing this for them. So they hired me to do that, and then. So part of that beat included the drug war, where you see a lot of the problems of the criminal justice system really kind of magnified. Right? It's a good way to seeing the war of the worst in the system is covering the drug war beat. And from that, there was one particular case, the Corey May case, which actually sort of unites the two books I've written so far. In that Corey was a guy who was raided by police in Mississippi as a black guy. They raided his house. For all intents and purposes, they'd raided the wrong house. He wakes up in the middle of the night and shoots and kills one of the cops. Immediately surrenders with bullets still left in his gun. Said he didn't know that they were the police, and ends up getting convicted of capital murder, which is the intentional killing of a police officer, and sentenced to death. It was I was researching a paper for Cato on police raids and SWAT teams and police militarization when I found that case. And I ended up going to Mississippi to write about that story for Reason magazine. They liked what I wrote, and so they ended up hiring me full time. But Dr. Hain actually did the autopsy in that case on the cop and gave some testimony at the trial that was scientifically dubious and helped convict Corey, basically cast doubt on his story. And so I started looking into Hain, and one thing I've learned over the years as a journalist is that if you find one example of, a cop who lies on a witness stand or a forensics expert who gives, questionable testimony, it's almost certain that you haven't found the only example. And so I started calling around and asking about Hain. And really the remarkable thing is I would call, first I started calling defense attorneys, and they all had their own stories about Dr. Hain. And then I would call other medical examiners, particularly in the South. And I would say, I'm a journalist looking into a medical examiner, and I wouldn't even have to finish the sentence. And they would say, oh, you're talking about Dr. Hain in Mississippi, right? It's about time somebody wrote about him.
Wow.
And over the years, I ended up getting hired by Huffington Post. And then after my first book came out, the Washington Post. And I've kind of, I can say when I started doing this, I was one of, I think, just a handful of journalists who were doing this beat sort of full time. And now it's great. I mean, this is the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform have become such a broad issue and broad beat that there are dozens of journalists that do this full time now. And there's still probably enough material to double or triple that number.
Right. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books. Duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind the scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to tracythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the Stacks. Did you, when you got into journalism, were you planning to do this? Or did you have were you like, I want to write about food?
I think the only thing I've known since I was about 10 is that I wanted to write for a living. But no, I grew up in rural Indiana, very white, conservative part of a very white and conservative state.
Right.
And it was working for Cato. I think kind of first got me, looking at things from a libertarian perspective. And then just over the years, just covering the criminal justice system, I think it was there and looking at the drug war and then looking kind of at policing issues, looking at prosecutorial misconduct and abuse that, the stories that I would come across on that beat, they just made me angry. I mean, they just really pissed me off. And at some point, I think I just decided that, writing, exposing these stories for a living would be a very kind of rewarding and fulfilling job, if occasionally depressing and
right.
Blood pressure inducing, and then it's also I just kind of discovered I really loved doing investigative journalism. I like reading through thick court files and reading trial transcripts and doing going on the road and interviewing people. I think I discovered I kind of had a knack for it, and I really enjoyed doing it.
Yeah, that's very cool. Did you, I guess all in, like when you guys decided to write this book together, how long did it take from kind of start to finish? I guess not including like the articles that you'd already written, but kind of when you were like, okay, we're going to make this book.
Well, I think our first draft, I think we got together in less than a year. I think it was probably 9 or 10 months, but then the legal vetting happened. And
right.
I think that added, I'd have to go back and sort of look at my calendar, but I think it added at least a year, maybe a year and a half to the process.
Wow.
So yeah, the initial putting the initial draft manuscript together didn't take that long, really. But yeah, it was the legal vetting that really drew out the process.
And how does it work for you, who your other job besides writing a book is being a writer, being a journalist? How do you kind of divide your time and your day, and like who, are you writing this book kind of like late at night or early in the morning, or are you reporting on this while you're writing the book? So it's kind of like one and the same.
Well, my first book, I took several months off to write the book. This one I wrote while still doing my regular job. And I don't know, I didn't find it, it definitely when you're kind of closing in on a deadline, it could be a little bit stressful, but really wasn't that difficult to put together even while working a full-time job. Part of it is, you would do, we would come across new cases and new stories while we were working on the book, which I would then write up as part of my regular job, kind of on the side. And then, part of it is I considered it kind of part of my regular job because we were talking to, other medical examiners. We were talking to other attorneys. We're talking to people who could ultimately become sources for me down the road for other stories. So I didn't feel, and I should say I checked it with my employer at the Washington Post, and they were okay with it also. So
we're not going to tattle on you. Don't worry. Like, he was writing a book on company time, big trouble. When you were writing, what sort of stuff were you watching or reading yourself or listening to that either informed the work or maybe like took you away from it, helped you escape so that you could still be creative in your writing process?
That's a good question. For informing it, I think just the usual stuff that I read and write about. I mean, I really love diving into history and histories of, sort of obscure histories. And so, some of the stuff we got into, some of that made it into the book, the final version of the book, some didn't. But, I really got into like Attica and the Attica Uprising.
Wait, did you read the Heather Ann Thompson book?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great book.
It's not the most amazing. That's the book that made me start this podcast.
Oh, wow.
Because I loved the book so much and nobody that I knew had read it. And my mom and stuff didn't really remember it because we're from California. And I was like, someone has to be talking about this book. And the only podcast I could find about it was like lawyers talking about it. And I was like, that's not exactly what I'm looking for. I'm going to make my own podcast. Anyways.
Wow. Well, I'm flattered to be on a podcast that was started because of her book.
Yeah.
But, there's a pretty amazing part of her book where they talk about this medical examiner who did the autopsies on the bodies, and he was basically the one who proved that the police raid on the prison didn't go down the way the police claimed it did. In fact, They shot a number of prisoners sort of almost in cold blood, or probably in cold blood. And for that, he was harassed basically for the rest of his life. And he turned out to be sort of heroic. There are other cases. The murder of now I can't think of his name, the Chicago Black Panther in Chicago.
Fred Hampton.
The Fred Hampton shooting. The medical examiner there in Cook County cast a lot of doubt on the way police claimed that raid went down. And then in the book, we get into a lot of the civil rights killings, from Emmett Till to the Freedom Riders, the triple murder of the Freedom Riders in the 1960s in Mississippi. And in all these cases, the way that those deaths were investigated and the role of the local county coroner and the medical examiners in those cases were crucial. And so that part of it I found really fascinating. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, we also really get into the history of coroners. So there are lots of like sort of history books, some of them somewhat obscure. I mean, you're looking into like medical history and coroner history and that kind of thing. But I really, really enjoyed that part of it. Probably more than I should, because you end up falling down these rabbit holes. And next thing you've been, reading, spent the last 6 or 7 hours reading about the fight between coroners and medical examiners, and none of that's really going to make it into your book. But
right. Have you seen John Oliver's thing that he just did a few weeks ago on coroners and medical examiners?
Yes, I did actually. I think John Oliver is doing amazing stuff. He's taking a lot of these complex issues and he's synthesizing them for a mass audience. I will say, as a journalist, it's a bit frustrating sometimes because, as I and other journalists have experienced, a lot of our material gets used on that show, and there's, it's not that it's not plagiarism or anything like that. It's just, some acknowledgement would be nice when they do that.
Interesting.
But that's the way that kind of thing works. And I am thrilled that these ideas are getting out there and are being, Oliver's real talent is like I said, taking these pretty complicated legal issues where you really, have to kind of get into the weeds, and then making it very palatable for a mass audience, and shining a spotlight on some real injustices, and for that, great. We should all be grateful to him. But, they do kind of borrow heavily from a lot of hard work the journalists have put into these issues. So, maybe just a shout out here or there would help.
Maybe just a little footnote would have been helpful.
Right. He did, I think in one episode, he sort of quoted from one of my posts and sort of attributed it to the Washington Post. So they do it occasionally,
right.
But
not enough.
Right. I think they could do it more.
Wow. I didn't even know that when I asked that question, but I'm glad that I did. How about this? So this is my favorite question, and writers are always like, you're such a weirdo for asking this, but what sort of snacks or beverages or rituals do you have around your writing?
Wow. That's a good question. I tend to have a glass of bourbon after I'm done writing, particularly some of this harder, you gotta do something to kind of take the edge off after writing about some of these things. Yeah, I don't really know about sort of snacks. I will say, I do have some sort of interesting quirks. So I have an office in our house. My wife and I both. My wife's also a journalist, and we both have offices in the house. But for whatever reason, I started. We have sort of a room right outside my office where there's a TV and a couch and elliptical machine, and for whatever reason, when I first started writing the book, when I kind of really sat down and first time I put several hours in, I happened to be on the couch with my laptop, and for whatever reason, that became kind of my place to write this particular book. So even though I have an office and a desk and a desktop computer, I ended up writing most of this book kind of sitting on a couch with a blanket on my lap on a laptop, 20 feet away from my desk. And I think that as a writer, I do that. I think you sort of get into, if one thing's kind of working for you, particularly when it comes to like my physical space where I'm writing. I first moved to Nashville from Washington, D.C. There was a coffee shop near my house. There were several, but I ended up writing, my first article from one, and then I just kind of would always go back to that coffee shop from then on, because whatever about it worked the first time, I figured it would continue working.
Yeah, you get like kind of in your little niche or something.
Yeah, and I think your brain just kind of turns on when you're back in whatever environment it was that, you originally started doing that particular task.
Yeah, I had an author once say she was a journalist also, and so she could work at her desk for her journalist job, but when she was writing her book, she also liked to be somewhere else in her house, just because it was like she was working on something kind of different, and it just was like she needed a slightly different shift because it was different writing for her mentally.
Yeah, I definitely can empathize with that.
Yeah. Did you have any like reactions to the book that surprised you, like one way or the other, or any way, I guess?
Well, we had one podcast, like a true crime sort of podcast, interview us about the book, and he began the podcast by telling us he hadn't read the book yet. So,
Thank you.
that was sort of odd. Strangely, though, he had actually interviewed Hain, which we couldn't get Hain to sit down for an interview with us. But yeah, that was sort of strange. I've had, as I'm sure any author you've interviewed has experienced this. A lot of you do interviews where it's clear the interviewer hasn't read the book, but you don't say anything, which is kind of a wink and a nod. But to have one admit it from the start was interesting. The other thing is, I guess, and this is kind of one of the disappointing things with this particular book. My first book was pretty topical. It was all about policing. The paperback came out just as Ferguson was happening, and so there was a ton of, I did a lot of cable TV. I had countless radio interviews, and for this book, there's no cable TV whatsoever, and our cable news, and the only real radio interview we did that I can remember was this like midnight to 3 a.m. show geared at truckers, and where the previous guest talked about UFOs. So, and I think the reason is, and we did a lot of book fairs for this, and we were doing the Mississippi Book Fair in Oxford, and I was talking to some other authors there, and basically if the problem right now, and actually my wife and I run into this because she covers the same beat I do. If it's not about Trump, there's just no interest, in if the show's anything, political or current events or news, it has to be about Trump or nobody wants to talk about it. And so I think issues like this are really getting Trump just kind of sucks the air out of the room, and there's no time for anything else. And that's been a little bit disappointing.
That is really disappointing because the story is so much tied to so much of our current history. I mean, it's also not that long ago, like the 90s is very, very
Right.
recent. But that's very disappointing because I think like the history in the book feels very relevant.
Well, and there are Trump, sort of connections. I mean, we don't get in. I can't remember. Maybe we do get into this in the book. I can't remember the exact timeline. It may have been. We may have already gotten the manuscript in. But Obama had set up the Forensic Science Commission to look into junk forensics that was being used in criminal trials. And one of the first things Sessions did after becoming Attorney General was to disband that commission. And so, that commission could conceivably have looked at places like Mississippi and, hopefully made some recommendations to clean things up. And that's not going to happen now.
Right, of course. Have you seen any positive changes or reforms since the book has come out? Maybe not in forensics, but kind of in the bureaucracy part of it, or?
I think Tucker would say that at this point, Hain is gone. And this, before the book came out, Hain had been effectively wasn't allowed to do any more autopsies, but he was still doing autopsies for defense attorneys. He was still testifying in old cases where he had already done the autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a new state medical examiner, very qualified guy. But, a lot of things that we talk about the book are happening all over again. So just, 6 or 7 months ago, there was a series of stories about how they had a huge backlog of bodies in Mississippi because the legislature wasn't sending enough money to the medical examiner's office to keep up on the autopsies. They couldn't hire enough staff. So there was a backlog. They were talking about privatizing, contracting out autopsies to private doctors, which is exactly how we got, how the state got Hain in the first place. So that part has been really interesting to watch. The one thing that we really kind of hope the book would accomplish, which it hasn't yet, is, what really needs to happen is the state needs to do a thorough review of every case in which either of these guys ever testified.
Right.
Because we really don't know how many people are innocent who are in prison there. And, there are who knows how many cases where somebody probably should have been prosecuted for something, but they weren't because of Hain's conclusions. And that could be because it was a 20-year-old black kid who died in the back of a police car, and Hain said it was a stroke, and it was something else. Or it could be, we talk about the kind of, the phrase Black Lives Matter. In Mississippi, for a long time, Black lives didn't matter to the point where, it didn't matter if innocent black people were convicted of crimes, but they also didn't matter in the sense that if you had a poor black person who died and, was clearly murdered, and the prosecutor or the local police chief just didn't want to investigate it, they just didn't want to have another unopened case on their hands, they could just call it an accident or a suicide or a natural death, and then magically the crime goes away because it never happened. And we don't know how many of those cases there were either.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the book, it's pretty shocking how little it takes for something to be decided. Like how like a hunch from a cop can become medical science from West like 20 seconds later. It's like, what? Yeah. Like, who's in charge here? That's what I kept saying. In your intro, you guys even talk about like, you're going to be angry and you're going to laugh and you're going to be like, what the fuck's going on? And I definitely found myself doing that, like as things were happening. And I was like, oh yeah, the person said, yeah, it's probably John. And then West is like, yeah, I found John's like fingerprints on a purse handle from an indentation from his mom's sister's leg. And you're like, wait, what?
Yeah,
this is real.
I mean, that's the thing is West. West was never good at generating new suspects. West could never go to a crime scene and say, "Look, I found out who did it, and it's somebody you guys never suspected."
Right.
What West was good at was giving police the air quotes science that they needed to confirm that it was the guy that they suspected all along. I mean, that's what his job was. All it took is, there's a process called tunnel vision in prosecutors and police that there've been studies about, and that it's this idea that, if early on in the process they think they already know who did it, then the investigation becomes not about following leads until you find out who did it, investigation starts with knowing who did it, and then you're just collecting evidence that confirms what you already think you know. And in the process, you end up not investigating a lot of leads that could lead to other people because you consider it a waste of time. And a lot of times those leads are forever lost. But in a lot of cases, the original killer gets away because those early leads, those early trails grow cold because they focused on the wrong person. And people like Hain and West really enabled that process because they told cops what they wanted to hear early on. They told prosecutors what they wanted to hear early on. And that just kind of, made them stop investigating, or at least doing a real investigation. And then it was just about collecting evidence against the guy they already had.
Right. For people who like this book, who've read it and enjoyed it, do you have any books you recommend that are maybe in conversation with or in the same vein, or books that you love that kind of feel similar?
Good question. I think our book is a little bit unique in that it's a mix of, it's sort of part true crime and part policy analysis, and it gets kind of deep into the legal weeds and into the policy. I think it was marketed as a true crime book, which makes some sense. But if you go to like Goodreads and Amazon, some of the reviewers I think were disappointed because they were expecting it to read more like a John Grisham novel.
Right.
But I will say one thing I can definitely recommend that I think is right in the bailiwick of the book, and it's very, very similar subject matter, is the In the Dark podcast about the Curtis Flowers case, which was in Mississippi. I'm pretty sure Hain did the autopsies in that case, but the autopsies themselves weren't particularly relevant to the broader story. But one thing that is very, very familiar about that case is, the idea that police and prosecutors decided early on that they knew who did it. And you'll find as you listen to that podcast, which is just enraging. I mean, the work that the journalist, I can't remember the woman's name now, but the journalists and the crew and the producers did on that show is extraordinary. I mean, they're going to free this guy, and it's going to be basically because of the work that they did. But it is as sort of, you read our book and then you listen to that podcast or in the reverse order, you'll find sort of the same kinds of systemic flaws that lead to the same sorts of errors, particularly when it comes to wrongful convictions.
Yeah. As soon as I announced that we were doing this book on the show, someone said, "Oh, you have to listen to In the Dark." And I was like, "I've already done that. Thank you." And then someone else messaged me and said that she'd loved the book so much, and she's, I guess, in school, and they're actually using it as a text for her forensics class or something. She has which I thought was pretty cool.
That is great to hear. Yeah. I mean, that warms my heart to hear that.
Well, yay. Well, that's pretty much it from me. Do you have anything else that you want to add before we get out of here?
Man, that's a good opening to throw something in, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. So
okay.
I think that means you ask good questions. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much. And Radley, Balko, and Tucker Carrington wrote this book, The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist. We'll be talking about it on the Stacks on August 28th. So you have plenty of time from now until then to read the book, but you won't need it because it goes by real quick.
The audio version is very good too.
The audio is, you said?
Yeah, the guy did a great job.
Oh, okay. Awesome. That's great to know. Well, Radley, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And we will see you guys in the Stacks. All right, we've come to the end of another episode of The Short Stacks. Thank you to Radley Balko for joining us today. Be sure to tune in on August 28th when we discuss The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist in detail. Thank you also to Jamie Lafer at Public Affair Books for setting up this interview. Everything we talk about on today's episode can be found in the show notes. For more information from The Stacks, follow us over on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram and at The Stacks Pod _ on Twitter. And check out our website, thestackspodcast.com. To join the Stacks Pack and get inside access to this show, go to patreon.com/thestacks. Make sure you're subscribed to this show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to rate and review. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tegirigis. This show was created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas, and I will see you in the Stacks.